Video games have always been centered around familiar themes. Games such as Pong may look primitive next to modern titles, yet they nonetheless revolve around similar keystones of competition and overcoming challenges. As the medium has been freed from the technological limits of the past, games have expanded to include wider themes such as storytelling, world building and symbolism. So whether we choose to look at video games as sheer entertainment or as honorary works of art in themselves, it does not remove from the fact that as games have evolved, they have become carriers of many pertinent messages about life and culture. The recent release by Japanese developer From Software titled Sekiro is an interesting example of this. The title is a fantastical action-adventure game set in the wartime Sengoku period of medieval Japan, whose main protagonist is a shinobi who is on a mission to rescue a young lord from captivity. From Software's most popular titles focus on the rewarding aspects of placing the player in increasingly arduous circumstances with minimal means of assistance or guidance. The payoff from overcoming these challenges yields a feeling of satisfaction and accomplishment that few other games can rival. To look at these games as senseless violence, let alone an incitement of it, is a low-resolution perspective often attributed to titles such as this. But I think that video games can be the subject of a deeper analysis, especially from the perspective that such media satisfy an outlet for primal passions that linger on through the noise of modern society. It was Sigmund Freud who, in his book Civilization and Its Discontents, wrote that civilized society was essentially a substitute for the atavistic instincts and drives which come as a part of our animal inheritance. Drives such as the impetus to feed or reproduce are not merely arbitrary matters. Like the underlying mechanics of a video game, they are what supply the cornerstones of our experience, and as a consequence, factor into our essential sense of being. And violence is another such element. Because whether or not we would like to admit it, violence is a natural accompaniment to existence. We could say to be alive is an act of violence in itself, because merely to exist necessitated that other lives needed to be violently dismembered and brought into the folds of our existence. And as a trade-off for the benefits of civilization, society tries to effect these drives in order to bring us into the folds of its existence. Now this brings with it a dilemma. That of being on the one hand an organic entity full of these irresistible drives, and on the other hand our responsibility to society. Since the birth of civilization, mankind has toiled with this dilemma, and in need of solutions, we have created outlets that satisfy the drives, while still enabling us to take part in the maintenance of society. However, despite being relieved of many of the hardships that befell our ancestors, one of the disadvantages to civilization is that we also become deprived of many informative and self-affirming virtues that came as a part of the hardships of our historical experience, meaning that as we soften in society, our vitality diminishes in the artificial nature of our arrangement, leading us to seek ways of addressing those areas that society lacks. We could say that civilized society has created its own drive, or at least amplified an existing one, the drive for existential fulfillment. And I think video games such as Sekiro represent a decent embodiment of this tension between nature and society, and the need to recapture a feeling of existential primacy that society has stolen from us. Games that rely upon survival through competition exploit our natural tendencies towards these primitive drives. We could also add to this that From Software's games capitalise on the primal rush of animal predation, with all its risk, longing, desperation, agony, and final catharsis. So Freud was right. Culture is, in many ways, the last sanctuary for the oldest and deepest parts of our nature. And since this is a game that draws heavily from Japanese culture, I thought it would be appropriate if we looked at more references from this region. When I was playing Sekiro, I remembered a book that I read a few years ago titled Hagakure by the famous Japanese author Yukio Mishima. Mishima was a renowned novelist, poet and cultural critic whose works such as Runaway Horses and The Sound of Waves became international bestsellers in the 1960s. Yet despite his literary success, he became a controversial figure in the West due to his nationalistic opinions. Mishima was deeply skeptical of what Western-style modernization had done to the integral character of his country, and this was bolstered by his interest in pre-industrial outlooks, especially the Bushido codes of the samurai military class, which he saw as containing a substance and lost wisdom that could act as a restorative to the spirits of modern Japan. The Hagakure itself was the product of an 18th century clerk, Yamamoto Tsunemoto, who also went by the moniker Yocho, and it was a manual of sorts within the samurai ethic of Bushido. Relevant to our previous statements on the effects of changing society on the drives, the book reflects on the problems of how to maintain the existential positives of a warrior outlook in a state of peacetime in which the book was written. The foundation of Yocho's philosophy stemmed from this simple line: "I discovered that the way of the samurai is death." In this simple statement, Yocho encapsulates an entire philosophy, which Mishima elaborates in the following: Hagakure is a living philosophy. It is not a tightly structured, consistent, logical system. So even though the impetus towards death is its nuclear starting point, this philosophy concentrates primarily upon the way which one operates in life, and the way in which orientating oneself towards death as a marker entirely restructures the way that one relates to existence. Mishima goes on to write that, if one assumes that humanity is always facing death, and that there is no truth except from moment to moment, then the process of time does not merit the respect that we accord it. His reason for saying that time doesn't deserve the respect that we accord it derives from the samurai perspective that time has a degenerative effect on human minds. To think that one will still be alive in 50 years makes one lazy and in the habit of forever tomorrowing one's plans. However, to live as if life could end only in an hour makes a person much more existentially present in the world. A samurai, unlike the man of Metropolis, does not take life for granted. And as one thinks each day will be one's last, something will be accumulated from day to day and moment to moment, and this accumulation will enable one eventually to serve one's lord well. Even though Sekiro is merely a video game, it nonetheless simulates these perspectives within its dynamics. Death is always placed on a considerably high emphasis. Even the game's tagline, "Shadows Die Twice," speaks to this. From Software's games have often centered around themes of death, both aesthetically and as a consequence of their unforgiving gameplay. Yet unlike previous titles where failure is met with a return to the last checkpoint, Sekiro gives you the option of either accepting failure or resurrecting with reduced health and having another go at overcoming your opponent. This may sound simple enough, but it actually requires some strategic thinking because, depending on the situation, you may think it better to go back and recuperate, or you might want to ride on the wave of momentum and see if you can win. This simple mechanic really taps into one's tolerance for resistance. There were many times playing the game where my timidity, or perhaps even my laziness, pressed me to simply give up, but there has been more than one occasion where I defied the odds and did the unthinkable, and the final exhilaration of actually having done that is what makes From Software's offerings so emotionally rewarding. The dynamics of death and accomplishment are also considered in the Hagakure, where Mishima is contemplating this statement by Yocho. Some say that to die without accomplishing one's mission is to die in vain, but this is the calculating Bushido of arrogant Osaka merchants. To make the correct choice in a 50-50 situation is nearly impossible. Mishima expands upon this by saying, accomplishing one's mission in modern times means to die righteously for a cause. Hagakure is saying that on the point of death, one is by no means able to evaluate the justice of the cause. We would all prefer to live, and so it is quite natural in such a situation that one should find some excuse for living on. Hagakure is simply expressing the relativistic position that rather than to live on as a coward, having failed in one's mission, it is better to die. Here is the nihilism of Yocho Yamamoto, and here too is the ultimate idealism born of this nihilism. These perspectives will inevitably find resistance within the pleasure-orientated cultures that even punishing experiences like Sekiro circulate in. Though it is also worth including that within this harsh outlook is an appreciation of the value of existence that our culture often fails to capture. This is embodied in this final quote by Yukio Mishima. We tend to suffer under the delusion that we are capable of dying for a belief or theory. What Hagakure is insisting is that even a merciless death, a futile death that bears neither flower or fruit, has dignity as the death of a human being. If we value so highly the dignity of life, how can we not also value the dignity of death? No death can be considered futile.